What would you do if your own sister humiliated you at dinner, stole your place in the family, and then came back months later, begging for the very thing your grandmother trusted you to protect? This is the story of how one woman in Kansas turned heartbreak into strength and showed her family that dignity is worth more than all the money in the world. Stay with me, because the twists in this story will leave you wondering how far family will go when love turns into greed, and how one quiet woman found the courage to fight back. Welcome to Voice of Granny. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment where you are watching from. I still remember the way the glass felt cold against my head before I even understood what was happening. One moment I was reaching across the table to pass the bowl of roasted potatoes, and the next water was dripping down my face, soaking through my blouse, sliding into the collar of my sweater. My fork clattered onto my plate as I gasped. My sister Sarah's hand didn't even shake when she set the empty glass back on the table. Her voice was sharper than I had ever heard it. "You've got 5 minutes to get out of my house." For a moment, the words didn't make sense. I sat frozen, blinking water out of my eyes, waiting for some kind of joke, some sign she was kidding. But there wasn't one. Sarah sat there, shoulders squared, eyes locked on me, glaring like I wasn't her own sister but some stranger who had barged into her home. No one moved. The dining room fell silent except for the soft clink of a fork sliding against a plate. My parents froze mid-bite, their forks still hovering in the air. My father's eyes shifted between me and Sarah. His jaw tight, but he didn't say a word. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she lowered her fork to her plate and stared down at her food. Michael, my brother-in-law, Sarah's husband, lowered his glass slowly, but he kept his eyes on the tablecloth, as if staring hard enough would make the whole scene disappear. The silence pressed against my ears harder than the water dripping into my lap. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice unsteady. "What are you doing?" She didn't answer. She just pointed toward the front door. Her jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles trembling in her cheek. I looked around the table, desperate for someone to break the tension, someone to tell her to stop this madness, to remind her that this was supposed to be a family dinner. But no one did. My mother's eyes dropped to her plate, her lips pressed thin. My father cleared his throat like he might speak, but he stayed silent. Michael rubbed at his chin and kept staring at the table as if he could pretend he wasn't there at all. The shame burned hotter than the soup that still sat untouched in front of me. My chest tightened. My throat ached. Part of me wanted to fight back, to demand an explanation, but the words were trapped somewhere deep inside. My voice felt caged. "Fine," I managed at last, barely more than a whisper. The chair screeched loudly against the hardwood floor as I pushed back. The sharp sound made everyone flinch, but still no one reached out. Not a single hand stopped me. My wet clothes clung heavy to my skin as I stood. The room smelled of rosemary and garlic bread, but all I could taste was the metallic sting of humiliation. My hands shook as I grabbed my coat off the back of my chair. Sarah didn't look at me again. She sat perfectly still, her arms folded across her chest, her face hard as stone, as if she hadn't just poured water on her own sister and thrown her out of her home. I lingered for a moment, waiting for someone, anyone, to call me back, to tell me to sit down, to say, "Let's talk about this." But no one did. My parents wouldn't meet my eyes. Michael still stared at the table. I walked to the front door, my shoes squishing against the floor, water dripping from my hair onto the rug. My hand hovered on the knob. I gave them one last chance. One last chance to undo this, to speak up, to show me I wasn't completely abandoned. But all I heard was the scrape of a fork against a plate. So I opened the door and walked out. The night air hit me sharp and cold, cutting through the damp fabric clinging to my skin. My hair dripped against my shoulders, water sliding down my back. The porch light flickered above me, casting everything in a pale, lonely glow. Behind me, the door closed with a click that echoed louder than Sarah's words. I hurried down the steps, my movements clumsy like I was wading through mud. My shoes slapped wet against the concrete. I didn't even know where I was going. I just needed to get away. From the table, from their silence, from the way my own family had let me walk out without a single word. My hands shook so badly I dropped my car keys twice before finally unlocking the door. I slid into the seat, the dampness of my clothes seeping into the upholstery. My chest rose and fell in quick bursts. My throat burned like I had swallowed fire. I sat there staring at the steering wheel, waiting for the door to open for someone to follow me out. But the porch light stayed still. The door never moved. The longer I sat there, the clearer it became. No one was coming. My parents had just sat there, pretending their forks and plates mattered more than their daughter being thrown out. Michael hadn't even looked me in the eye. The shame at that dinner table had cut deep, but this, the quiet abandonment, cut even deeper. I started the engine, and the headlights washed over Sarah's perfect lawn as I pulled away. The windshield wipers swept away streaks of water as streetlights blurred into long lines through my tears. Over and over I heard her voice in my head. 5 minutes to get out. By the time I reached my small apartment on the edge of town, anger had twisted itself together with something heavier. It wasn't just about dinner. That much was clear. I sat in the car outside my building, my clothes damp and cold, and thought about the look in Sarah's eyes, the tension in her jaw, the way my parents had looked away. This hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been building for years. I thought back to childhood holidays when Sarah rolled her eyes if someone praised me. To birthdays when her gifts felt more like obligations than gestures of love. To cutting remarks she brushed off as jokes. Little things I had ignored, telling myself I was imagining them. But tonight, all of it had boiled over. Sarah had never let go of the grudges she carried. Maybe it was jealousy. Maybe it was resentment. Maybe it was something she could never put into words. But tonight had proven one thing beyond doubt. She had been waiting for the right moment to strike. And she hadn't cared who got hurt in the process. Sitting in the dark of my car, water still pooling on the seat beneath me, I finally understood. That dinner wasn't the beginning of a fight. It was the end of whatever bond we had left. The sister I grew up with, the one I whispered secrets to under the covers, the one I ran with through the wheat fields behind Grandma Ruth's house in Hutchinson, Kansas, that sister was gone. What sat at that table tonight wasn't my sister. It was someone who had been carrying bitterness for years, someone who had been waiting for this very moment. And she had used it on me. I couldn't stop thinking back to our childhood, the long summers when Grandma Ruth kept us busy in her little farmhouse. She had a way of telling stories that made time slow down. She'd sit us on the porch swing, the smell of honeysuckle in the air, and tell us about the Dust Bowl years, about raising kids with hardly a dime to spare, about keeping faith when the skies were dry and the crops died. I was the one who listened. I was the one who sat still long enough to hear her. Sarah was restless, always itching to run off with her friends, always moving, always chasing something. Grandma loved her too, but when it came to secrets or recipes, or those long afternoons when she'd hum old hymns while snapping green beans, it was me Grandma turned to. At the time I didn't think it meant anything. I thought Sarah didn't care about that kind of closeness. But maybe even then, resentment had started to take root. She'd make little comments like, "Of course Grandma picked you," whenever I was asked to help in the kitchen or ride along to church with Grandma. I laughed it off back then, thought she was teasing. But maybe I should have paid more attention to the sting behind her words. When Grandma Ruth passed away, the cracks widened. She left me her locket with a faded photograph, a quilt she'd stitched by hand, a small savings account, and some keepsake she'd treasured all her life. Nothing extravagant, but everything meaningful. To me, they were pieces of her heart. To Sarah, they were proof. Proof that Grandma had loved me more. I even tried to share. I offered Sarah the quilt, remembering how we both used to curl under it during thunderstorms, listening to the rain pound against the tin roof. But she shoved it back at me. "I don't want your charity." That was the first time I realized just how deep her bitterness ran. My parents didn't help. Without meaning to, they made it worse. They praised me for being thoughtful, for helping Grandma in her last months, for remembering to call her every weekend. Sarah would sit at the table, arms crossed, eyes hard. They thought she didn't care. But I knew better. I could see it in her silence. Years passed. Sarah got married, bought a house in Wichita, started hosting family dinners. I convinced myself the old resentments had faded. She smiled in pictures. She hugged me at Christmas. She made small talk at birthdays. I let myself believe we had moved on. But that dinner table proved me wrong. It hadn't faded. It had been simmering quietly, waiting, and tonight, she had let it spill over in the cruelest way. As I sat in my car that night, soaked and trembling, I knew something had ended forever. The bond of sisterhood had been broken. And the girl who had once been my closest companion had become my greatest betrayer. And I had no idea then, as I dragged myself up to my little apartment and peeled off my wet clothes, just how far her bitterness would go. The morning after that dinner, I woke to the sound of rain tapping softly against my window. For a moment, as I lay staring at the ceiling, I almost forgot what had happened. The sound was peaceful, almost comforting, like the rainstorms Grandma Ruth used to hum through. But then I rolled over, and the damp pile of clothes on the floor brought everything rushing back. The humiliation, the silence, the way my sister had looked at me with such coldness. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and just lay there for a while. My body felt heavy, like I'd run for miles even though I had only driven home and collapsed on the couch. My chest still ached. My mind replayed every detail of the night before. My sister's voice. My parents' silence. Michael's refusal to even meet my eyes. I thought about calling Mom. I wanted to ask her why she didn't stop Sarah. Why she didn't say anything when her daughter was being humiliated at the table. I picked up my phone more than once. But each time I stared at her name on the screen, my hand froze. Because I already knew what she would say. She would tell me I was overreacting. She would say Sarah didn't mean it, that she was stressed, that family fights happen. She would beg me to let it go for the sake of peace. But how do you let go of something like that? How do you forget the image of your family sitting frozen, pretending they were blind, pretending they couldn't see what was being done to you? The truth was, I didn't have the strength to hear her excuses. So I didn't call. Instead, I made coffee, sat by the window and watched the rain. For days, I moved through life like a ghost. I went to work at the little library where I spent my afternoons shelving books and helping children find stories. I smiled when I had to. I answered questions. But as soon as the quiet of the library returned, my mind slipped back to that dinner table. It was like a splinter under the skin. Small, invisible to others, but sharp and constant. One evening, as I was stacking returned books, I thought back to childhood again, to all those little signs I had ignored. Sarah's sighs when Grandma asked me to help her. Her sharp laugh when I came home with a good grade. The way she muttered, "Of course," whenever people compared us. I had thought it was normal sibling rivalry. I thought she'd grow out of it. But now I realized it had been something darker. Resentment had taken root in her early on, and she had let it grow unchecked. And then I thought about Grandma Ruth's will. The reading of the will had been quiet, just family sitting in the lawyer's office on Main Street. Sarah had sat stiff in her chair, her lips pressed so tight they turned pale. Grandma hadn't left us anything extravagant. She didn't have much to give. But she gave me her locket, her quilt, her recipe box, a small savings account, and something I hadn't even known she owned. A few bonds and a patch of land outside of town. When the lawyer read my name beside those things, Sarah didn't speak. But I saw her hand curl into a fist on her lap. I thought she would talk to me about it later. I thought maybe we could share, maybe I could offer her part of what was left. But she never asked. She never even mentioned it. Instead, she buried her feelings deep, letting them simmer year after year, until finally, they boiled over in the ugliest way. I didn't realize how much that inheritance had poisoned her heart until weeks after the dinner, when I visited my Aunt May. Aunt May was Grandma's younger sister. She lived in a small yellow house at the edge of Hutchinson, with a porch full of flower pots and wind chimes that never seemed to stop singing. She had always been the one I went to when life felt heavy. She had the same soft eyes as Grandma Ruth, the same steady way of listening that made you feel safe. When she opened the door that day, she pulled me into a hug before I could even say a word. "I heard what happened at Sarah's," she whispered into my hair. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I hadn't planned on crying, but the moment she said it, the tears came hot and fast. I sank into her living room couch, and she sat beside me, handing me tissues, letting me spill everything. I told her about the water, about Sarah's voice, about the silence from everyone else. I told her how broken it had left me, how it felt like the final nail in a coffin I hadn't realized was already built. Aunt May listened quietly, nodding, her hand resting gently on mine. When I finally fell silent, she sighed. You know, Emily, she said softly, Sarah has been holding this inside for a long time. Longer than you think. I frowned. What do you mean? Aunt May leaned back, her gaze drifting to the window where the wind chimes swayed. Sarah found out about the land before the will was even read. One of Grandma's neighbors mentioned it, and she realized Ruth had already told the lawyer it was going to you. She carried that knowledge for months before Grandma even passed. I sat stunned. She knew. All that time. Aunt May nodded. She knew. And it ate her alive. She thought it meant Ruth didn't love her. She thought it was proof she'd always been second best. I pressed the tissue to my face. But it wasn't about love. It was about trust. Grandma gave me those things because she knew I'd take care of them. She knew I'd keep her recipes alive, keep the locket safe, hold on to the land. I know that, Aunt May said gently. You know that. But Sarah couldn't see it. All she saw was a comparison. All she saw was a choice, and she wasn't the one chosen. The words sank heavy in my chest. So all this time, while I thought Sarah and I were mending, while I thought family dinners and birthday gatherings meant we were building a bridge again, she had been sitting quietly with that poison inside her, letting it harden. She wanted to hurt you, Aunt May said softly. And she chose that night to do it. Closed my eyes. The image of her face that night came rushing back, her jaw tight, her eyes filled with something I couldn't name. It hadn't been a sudden outburst. It had been planned, calculated. She had been waiting for that moment. And the silence of everyone else had only made it worse. For weeks after visiting Aunt May, I carried those words around like stones in my pocket. Heavy, unshakable. Every time my phone buzzed with a family group text, I ignored it. Every time my mother called, I let it ring. I couldn't face them yet. Not when their silence echoed louder than Sarah's words. But in that silence, I started to learn something about myself. I learned how to sit in my own apartment without feeling lonely. I learned how to take long walks through the wheat fields outside town, breathing in the wide Kansas sky, reminding myself there was still beauty in the world even if my family had failed me. I learned to find comfort in the small things, stacking books in order, brewing tea, reading old letters from Grandma Ruth that I had tucked away. It was during those quiet evenings, sitting with a blanket wrapped around me and one of Grandma's letters in my hand, that I began to realize something important. Sometimes family betrays you not in big storms, but in small silences. Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't from the words shouted at you, but from the words left unsaid. And Sarah's silence all those years, her refusal to speak her bitterness, her choice to let it fester, had turned her into a stranger. But if she could choose silence, then so could I. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to fight, didn't need to prove myself. My silence would be different. Mine would be the silence of strength, of stepping back, of refusing to be dragged into the pit she had dug for herself. I couldn't forgive her, not yet, maybe not ever. But I could choose not to let her hatred rule my heart. And that choice, though it felt small, was the first step toward freedom. What I didn't know then was that Sarah wasn't done. Her bitterness hadn't finished its work. She and Michael would come back into my life soon. Not with kindness, not with an apology, but with a new kind of hunger. Because their lives, so perfect on the outside, were already starting to fall apart. And soon they would come knocking on my door, pretending to reconcile, pretending to reach out in love. But the truth behind their smiles would be far darker. The weeks slipped into months, and winter settled heavy across Kansas. The fields that once swayed gold in the wind now stretched gray and bare, the sky low and heavy above them. I found myself walking those fields often, crunching through patches of frozen soil, letting the wide emptiness steady me. There was something about the Kansas sky. It was so big, so endless, it made my problems feel smaller. I needed that. Because even though I had chosen silence, the hurt still lingered. I carried it like a bruise that refused to fade. At the library, I poured myself into the work. The children who came in with their backpacks and bright eyes became a kind of medicine. I'd kneel beside them, helping them find a book about dinosaurs or fairy tales. And for a few moments, I forgot about Sarah's face at that table, about my parents' silence. In those moments, I felt useful, felt whole. I even started teaching a Saturday story hour, just like Grandma Ruth used to do for me when I was little. I'd sit cross-legged on the rug with kids gathered around, their eyes wide as I read aloud. Sometimes I'd catch myself humming one of Grandma's tunes under my breath as I turned the pages. It made me feel like a piece of her was still alive in me. In the evenings, I'd return to my apartment, heat a bowl of soup, and sit at the small wooden table by the window. I started writing in a notebook. Just small things, little reflections. It wasn't a diary, not exactly. More like a conversation with myself. I wrote about the silence at the dinner table. I wrote about the lessons Grandma had taught me. I wrote about how it felt to stand alone but still stand tall. Those pages became my secret strength. But life, as it always does, kept moving. The town of Hutchinson bustled with its ordinary rhythm. The church bells still rang on Sunday mornings. The diner on Main Street still filled with laughter and clinking coffee cups. People still waved when I passed by. From the outside, nothing had changed. Except that it had. One evening, just as the sun was slipping low behind the flat horizon, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and froze. 'Twas Sarah. For weeks I had ignored her, deleted her texts without reading them. But something in me hesitated this time. My finger hovered above the button before I finally swiped it open. Her message was short. "Can we talk?" My chest tightened. I stared at the words for a long time. Part of me wanted to throw the phone across the room. Part of me wanted to reply with all the hurt I had been carrying. But another part of me, small, cautious, curious, just sat in silence. I didn't answer. The next day she called. I let it ring until it stopped. Then again the next evening. And again after that. After the fourth call, I finally listened to the voicemail. "Hey, Em," her voice said, softer than I remembered. I know things got out of hand that night. I shouldn't have lost my temper. I've been thinking a lot about Grandma, about us. I don't want to fight anymore. Can we start over? The words might have sounded sweet to someone else. But to me they felt heavy, calculated. Sarah's voice was smooth, but not genuine. There was no trembling, no real apology, no admission of what she had done. Just a vague excuse wrapped in honey. Still, I saved the voicemail. Something in my gut told me I might need it later. Aunt May called the next day, her voice steady as always. "Emily, honey, I think Sarah's in trouble." My heart sank. "What kind of trouble?" "The financial kind," Aunt May said. "Michael's business isn't doing well. They've been living bigger than they can afford. The cars, the house, the vacations, it's catching up with them. I heard from a friend at church that they're behind on payments." I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. Suddenly, Sarah's sudden interest in reconciliation made more sense. "She doesn't want peace," I whispered. "She wants money." Aunt May sighed. "I think you're right. Just be careful, Emily. Sometimes desperation makes people do cruel things." I thanked her, but after we hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, staring out at the snow falling lightly against the glass. I thought about Sarah's house. Big, beautiful, full of shiny things. I thought about how she loved hosting dinners, loved showing off, loved being the center of attention. I thought about Michael, always bragging about his new business deals. And then I thought about the land Grandma had left me. Quiet land on the edge of town. Not glamorous, not flashy, but valuable. Land that Sarah had wanted. Land she believed should have been hers. Clicked then. This wasn't about family. This wasn't about love. It was about survival and greed. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's messages kept coming. Some were soft, gentle, pretending to be full of love. I miss you. We should get coffee. Family is too important to stay angry. Others were more direct. Michael and I were talking. Maybe we could all work together on the land Grandma left you. It could be an investment for all of us. I didn't reply, but I saved every single message. Because I knew what was coming. And I knew that this time I wouldn't be caught off guard. In the quiet of my apartment, I began preparing. I bought a small notebook just for Sarah and Michael. Every time they texted, I copied the words. Every voicemail I transcribed. Every call I answered, I recorded in detail. I wasn't sure yet what I would do with it all, but I knew I needed it. Because I could feel it, the storm building on the horizon. And when it finally broke, I wanted to be ready. In the meantime, I kept living my quiet life. I showed up at the library. I walked the fields. Cooked simple meals. I wrote in my journal. Piece by piece, I rebuilt myself from the inside out. And though the wound Sarah had given me still ached, I learned to carry it with dignity. Because that was the difference between us. Sarah's bitterness had turned her into someone cruel, someone desperate, someone hollow. But my pain, it wasn't making me cruel. It was making me strong. And soon, that strength would be tested in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Because Sarah and Michael weren't about to give up. And when they came knocking on my door, I would have to decide how far I was willing to go to protect what Grandma Ruth had entrusted to me. The first time Sarah and Michael showed up at my apartment, I wasn't surprised. I had just gotten home from the library, my arms full of returned books, when I saw their car parked out front. It was the same silver SUV Sarah loved to show off, though the shine had dulled, and I noticed a crack in the rear bumper. They were leaning against it, waiting. Sarah's arms were crossed, her expression unreadable. Michael was scrolling on his phone, tapping his foot impatiently. My stomach tightened. I thought about driving away, circling the block until they gave up. But something inside me, steady and stubborn, told me not to run. This was my home. I had nothing to hide. I parked, gathered my things, and walked slowly toward the door. Sarah straightened, forcing a smile. Emily. Finally. Hi, I said quietly, unlocking my door. Michael slid his phone into his pocket and gave me a quick nod. We were in the neighborhood. Thought we'd stop by. I didn't invite them in right away. I let them stand there, awkward in the cold, until Sarah shifted uncomfortably. Can we come inside? It's freezing out here. I hesitated for a moment before opening the door wider. Fine. A few minutes. They stepped in, bringing with them the faint smell of expensive cologne mixed with coffee. My apartment was small, plain, nothing like Sarah's polished house. I saw her eyes flick across the worn couch, the thrift store coffee table, the stack of books by the window. She didn't say anything, but the faint curl of her lips told me she noticed. I set my keys on the counter and turned to face them. What do you want? Sarah pressed her hands together, trying to look calm. Look, I know things have been tense. That night at dinner, I went too far. Sorry. I don't want us to be like this. We're sisters. Her voice was softer than it had been in months, but there was something practiced in it, something too smooth. Michael stepped in quickly, his tone cheerful, almost rehearsed. Yeah, family fights happen. But family is family, right? We should stick together. Especially now. I stayed silent. Sarah glanced at him before continuing. We were thinking. Grandma left you that land, right? Just sitting there. Could be worth a lot if someone invested in it. Michael has some business contacts. If we work together, we could all benefit. It'd be good for the family. There it was. The truth behind the smiles. I leaned against the counter, my arms folded. The land isn't for sale. Sarah's smile faltered. We're not saying you should sell it. We're saying we could build something there. Partnership. It would honor Grandma's memory. By making money off it. Yes. Her eyes flashed. Just for a moment, I saw the sharpness beneath the surface. But she smoothed it over quickly. By building something that lasts. Something for the future. Michael nodded eagerly. It's a great opportunity, Emily. You don't want to waste it. I felt the familiar ache in my chest, but I pushed it down. I remembered Aunt May's warning. I remembered every saved text, every voicemail. This was the moment I had been preparing for. I'll think about it, I said flatly. Their faces lit up with relief. That's all we ask, Sarah said. When they left, I closed the door quietly and leaned against it, letting out a long breath. My hands were trembling, but not from fear. From anger. From the way they had tried to dress up greed as love. From the way they had dared to use Grandma's memory as a bargaining chip. I walked to my desk, pulled out the small notebook, and wrote down everything they had said. Every word, every expression, every hint. Because I knew this was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, their efforts grew bolder. Sarah called almost every evening. Sometimes her voice was sweet, talking about childhood memories, asking how I was doing. Sometimes it was sharper, reminding me how much responsibility land required. Hinting that I might not be capable of handling it alone. Michael sent texts about business opportunities and timing the market. He sent me articles about land development, circled numbers that promised huge profits. First, I only wrote them down. But then I started saving the actual messages, screenshotting them, forwarding voicemails to a separate folder. I even downloaded an app that automatically recorded calls. Each time I did it, my heart raced. Felt sneaky. But it also felt necessary. Because Sarah and Michael weren't coming to me as family. They were coming as predators. And predators didn't stop just because you asked them to. One Sunday afternoon, they invited me to their house. Against my better judgment, I went. Part of me wanted to see with my own eyes how bad things had gotten. Their home was the same large brick house in Wichita I remembered. But it looked different now. The paint on the porch was peeling. A patch of shingles on the roof sagged. Inside, the furniture was still polished, but there was an emptiness in the air. The laughter that once filled the place was gone. Sarah poured coffee in chipped mugs and smiled too brightly. Michael spread out papers on the table. Charts, contracts, proposals. If you just sign here, he said, tapping a line, we can get started. You won't have to lift a finger. The returns will be incredible. I glanced at the papers. At the bottom was a line that would give them control over the land. I looked up slowly. You expect me to sign this? Sarah's smile wavered. It's just a formality. It's giving you ownership. It shifted. Temporary ownership. Just for business purposes. Michael leaned forward, his voice low. Emily, this is the best thing you could do for yourself. Otherwise that land is going to waste. Do you really think you can manage it on your own? The words cut, but I didn't let it show. I closed the folder calmly, slid it back across the table and said, I'm not signing anything. The room went still. Sarah's face hardened. Michael's jaw tightened. For a long moment no one spoke. Finally Sarah forced a laugh. We'll talk again. You'll change your mind. I left soon after. As I drove back to Hutchinson, my hands gripping the wheel, I realized just how far they were willing to go. They weren't asking anymore. They were pushing, pressing, testing how far they could bend me. But they didn't know something. They didn't know that every call, every text, every piece of paper, every word, I had it all. And when the time came, I wouldn't be the one cornered. They would. Back in my apartment, I sat with Grandma Ruth's quilt around my shoulders and whispered into the quiet. I won't let you down. Because this wasn't just about land anymore. It wasn't just about money. It was about dignity. It was about truth. It was about finally holding up a mirror to Sarah and Michael and letting them see what they had become. And I knew the moment was coming. The storm I had been watching gather on the horizon was almost here. And this time I was ready. The day everything came crashing down didn't arrive suddenly. It built slowly, like thunder rumbling in the distance, growing louder each week until the sky finally split open. Sarah and Michael had been circling me for months. First it was polite phone calls, then urgent texts, then angry visits. They dangled promises of family unity, of future wealth, but their voices carried desperation they could no longer hide. Their smiles cracked too easily, their tones snapped too quickly. I could almost see the walls of their life crumbling behind them. And then came the letter. It arrived in a crisp white envelope, slid under my apartment door one Tuesday morning. No stamp, no address, just my name written in Sarah's sharp handwriting. Inside was a short note. Emily, you're being selfish. We need that land. You'll regret standing in the way. Think of what's best for everyone. My hands trembled as I read it. Not from fear anymore, but from something colder, steadier. They weren't even pretending now. They weren't masking their hunger with kindness. They had stripped away the last bit of pretense. And that was when I knew it was time. That Friday I called them. My voice didn't shake as I asked them to meet me at Aunt May's house. I told them we needed to settle things once and for all. They agreed instantly, maybe thinking I had finally broken down, finally come to my senses. But what they didn't know was that Aunt May would be there. And so would her lawyer friend. And so would the small black folder I had been carefully filling for months. When the day came, I drove to May's place early. It was a little white farmhouse on the edge of town, with a wraparound porch and the smell of fresh-baked cornbread drifting from the kitchen. May hugged me tight when I walked in, her hands warm, her eyes steady. "You sure you're ready for this?" she asked softly. He nodded. "It's time." At 2 o'clock sharp, Sarah's SUV pulled up, kicking up dust on the gravel driveway. She climbed out, wearing her best coat, her hair perfectly styled. Michael followed, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. From a distance, they looked like a power couple walking into a boardroom. But up close, I saw the lines of stress etched around their eyes, the nervous twitch in Sarah's jaw, the way Michael's tie was knotted too tightly. "Emily," Sarah said as she stepped inside, her voice bright, almost triumphant. "I knew you'd come around." I didn't answer. I just gestured toward the living room, where Aunt May sat in her chair, and beside her Mr. Davis, a lawyer in a plain gray suit, held a stack of papers. Michael hesitated when he saw them, but Sarah brushed past, settling on the couch with a confident smile. "Good. We can finally talk like adults." "Let's talk," I said, my voice calm. For a moment, the room was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Then Sarah leaned forward. "Emily, this has gone on long enough. That land is wasted in your hands. Michael and I have the resources to turn it into something meaningful. You'll get a share, of course, but we need control. It's the only logical choice." Michael nodded quickly, pulling out his folder of contracts. "We've already drafted the agreement. All it takes is your signature." I looked at the papers, then back at them. My heart was beating fast, but I kept my face steady. "You've been saying this for months. But I think there's something you should both hear." I reached into my bag and pulled out my black folder. Sarah's eyes narrowed just slightly. Michael shifted uncomfortably. "What's that?" Sarah asked. "Proof," I said simply. I opened the folder and laid out the printouts on the coffee table. Messages, screenshots, transcripts of voicemails. I pressed play on my phone, and their own voices filled the room. Sarah's sharp tone demanding I stop being selfish. Michael's smooth persuasion telling me I wasn't capable. Sarah's threat from the letter, her words echoing through the small room. Their faces drained of color. "Emily," Sarah started, her voice tight. Cut her off. "For months, you've tried to manipulate me. You've pretended it was about family, but it was never about that. It was about money. About control. Grandma Ruth trusted me with that land, and I won't dishonor her memory by handing it over to people who only see dollar signs." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. Michael looked down at his hands, silent. Aunt May leaned forward then, her voice calm but firm. "Ruth saw this coming. She told me once, years ago, that she left that land to Emily because she knew Emily would protect it, not exploit it. I think we all see now that she was right." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, But they weren't soft, grieving tears. They were hot, angry tears. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You'll regret this," she spat. "You think you're better than us. Sitting here with your notebooks and your lawyer. You're nothing, Emily. Nothing." Her words pierced, sharp as knives, but I didn't flinch. I let them hang in the air, heavy and bitter. Then I said quietly, "Maybe I am nothing in your eyes. But at least I still have my dignity. At least I can look in the mirror and not see a liar." The room went still. Michael tugged at her sleeve, muttering, "Sarah, let's go." She shook him off, glaring at me one last time before storming out the door. Michael followed silently, his briefcase forgotten on the floor. The sound of their SUV's engine roared to life, then faded down the road until all that was left was silence. I sat back, my chest rising and falling, the weight of months finally lifting. Aunt May reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. I smiled faintly, though tears blurred my eyes. I couldn't let them win. "You didn't," she said. "You stood your ground. That's more than most people ever manage." That night, as I lay under Grandma Ruth's quilt, the events replayed in my mind. Sarah's rage, Michael's silence, May's steady voice, and my own firm, unwavering for the first time in years. I realized then that this wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. Because I wasn't the quiet shadow anymore, the sister who always stayed in the background. I was the keeper of Grandma's legacy. I was the one who had found strength in the rubble of humiliation. I had learned that family wasn't just blood. It was the people who stood by you, who told you the truth, who lifted you up when the world tried to break you. In the months that followed, Sarah and Michael kept their distance. I heard whispers that their finances had collapsed further, that they sold their house, that Michael's business failed. But I didn't chase the details. It wasn't my burden to carry anymore. Instead, I spent quiet afternoons walking Grandma's land, listening to the wind in the wheat, the creak of the old barn, the song of meadowlarks in the distance. Each sound was a reminder that Ruth's gift wasn't just soil and wood. It was peace, it was heritage, it was a promise that I wasn't alone. Sometimes I sat by the big oak tree at the center of the field, running my hands over its rough bark, and I whispered, "I kept my word, Grandma. I protected it. I protected us." And in those moments I felt her there. Not in a voice or a vision, but in the quiet certainty that love, real love, doesn't fade. It roots itself deep, like the oak tree, like the land itself. Looking back now, I see that everything had to happen the way it did. The humiliation, the betrayal, the anger, it all led me here. To strength I didn't know I had. To peace I didn't think I deserved. To the truth that even when family turns against you, you can still stand tall. And maybe that's what life is about. Not avoiding storms, but learning to stand in them, letting the wind strip away what isn't real until only what matters remains. So when people ask me if I regret it, if I regret standing up to Sarah, if I regret holding on to land that brought me so much pain, I tell them no. Because it wasn't just land. It was a promise. And a promise kept is worth more than all the money in the world.